Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Arcane Age series here on Lore Diver. Tonight we're diving into the lore of Imaskar, arguably the oldest human dominant civilization on Faerun, if not on Toril in general. This nation and people were instrumental in creating a lot of the modern world, although it doesn't get much credit for it because it's outside of the regular adventuring area that Forgotten Realms tends to focus on. So, this episode aims to change all that. Before we start, if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. And if you dig what I'm doing, please consider supporting me either on Ko-fi or Patreon. So, let's get to it. Hopefully this episode will not have the numerous technical glitches that I had last time. So, wow, that was rough. Anyways, coexisting powers and their relationships. So, who is around when they are around? Reasonable question. So in deep antiquity, so this is the minus 8,000 to minus 4,000 DR period, Imaskar becomes the first recorded human-dominant civilization and nation on Faerun and on Kara-Tur as well. That is how large the empire ultimately was, that it stretched across both sides of the continent. The powers it shares the world with in this period are Sonoria, Kalimshan, Yuri Shanyar, tried to pronounce it this time, Nekiramath, Mershulk, and Jamdath. And of these, only Kalimshan had near the existence that Imaskar did. So, yeah, like, it had neighbors right off the hop and developing through the time that it existed. And I think in this era that it's fair to say that they had pretty limited interactions with just about everybody except for possibly Jamdath and Kalimshan, largely because a lot of the elf nations weren't all that friendly at the time. We're just coming off the horrors of the Crown Wars, and a lot of them are sort of like, they're quite distant, so it'd be hard to swing, but not impossible. Now, in antiquity, the minus 4,000 to minus 1,000 DR period, and in Imaskar, this era sees a huge, like its highest heights and greatest falls. Its contemporaries are Nethril, Kalimshan, Jamdath, Kormanthir, Nekiramath, Yuri Shanyar, Rythaim? Not sure how to pronounce that. Sonoria, Mershulk, and very briefly, Chult. They're known to have traded with both dwarves, who they gained access to steel technology from, and with Nethril, who they had a limited exchange of magical items and techniques. It's possible that Nethril gained its anti-deity philosophy from Imaskar, but I will be getting into that later because it's a really weird kettle of fish with that one. And then finally we have the Fall of Magic period, and that's the minus 1,000 to 1 DR period. And Imaskar doesn't make it, not directly, into this era. The Imaskar that I'm going to be discussing is more or less gone before this time period even comes about. So, overview. Imaskar. Okay, this place is also known as the Raurin Empire, or sorry, the Rorin. There we go, Rorin Empire. And is currently the oldest known human-dominant civilization on Toril. It was formed in the centuries following the fall of the Elven civilizations, and reached heights of arcane power that rivaled Nethril, albeit with a different focus. Now, Imaskar was led by artificers as opposed to arcanists, and their mastery of dimensional and extra-dimensional magic was unparalleled. To put it in perspective and to use a Doctor Who reference, if you assume that any major Imaskari edifice, fortresses, palaces, towns, cities, or so on, are more or less a TARDIS that is packed with other smaller TARDISes, you are making a very safe assumption. Like, that is the level of magic that they had achieved during their run. Like, and their mastery of portal magic was also unparalleled, and I'll get to that in a moment. Now, as a location and a people, this is just like an overall thing, Imaskar suffered more than most in terms of continuity and lore between editions. In effect, like where Nethril had one major and one minor retcon, Imaskar had two major retcons, and they wildly changed not only like the history of Imaskar, but also the history of the surrounding nations of Thay, Murgholm, Mulhoran, Chesenta, and Unther. Like Semfar. It changed everything with each major retcon they did, and they never really addressed it as well as it probably could have been. So that you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment when I get to that. Now, Names: Imaskar Empire, Roran Empire. These are used almost interchangeably through the early edition, or through second and third edition. It starts out with Roran Empire, and then it becomes Imaskar, then it's back to Roran, and finally all settles down. In fourth edition, it's Imaskar. That's it. No more Roran Empire. Dates of existence: it was founded in minus 8,350 DR, and then collapsed in minus 2,488 DR, for a total of 5,862 years of continuous existence. And I believe that is the second longest existing human nation on the planet. Its only competition is Kalimshan. But Kalimshan's numbers get a little bit squidgy because for a lot of the early years they were a Jinn and genie dominated civilization before the humans would take over. So that is more than a fair run. Like, that is like the bulk of our known human history in the real world sort of lengths there. Possible known and possible survivor states. So Imaskar has a lot going on here, and I'm only really counting the survivor states here that have like more direct cultural links to the Imaskari, and not some of the more questionable ones like Termish, for example, who's going to come up again later. So first up is Anok Imaskar, Deep Imaskar, which is familiar to anybody who got heavy into 4th edition. High Imaskar, also very familiar to anyone who got heavy into 4th edition. Solon, Semfar, which is a mysterious nation that barely gets onto most maps and doesn't really get covered by anybody. And finally, Methwood is their possible survivor state. And yes, I know Methwood is an extremely unfortunate name, but I guess just meth wasn't a thing, or like a big thing that people knew a lot about when this was originally written. So, whatever. So geospatial information. At its height, Imaskar stretched as far west as the Methwood and the Methmere. Sorry, I find those names very funny. And dominated the Alhambra Sea area. So this is where like modern Unther, Mulhorand, and all those sorts of places are. Eastwards, it controlled the entirety of what's now Rawan the Death Desert, Samfar, and up into the Chunfeng province of Shulong, up on the Rakati Plateau area. Its northern boundaries were the mountains and forests that separated the Endless Waste and Thay from the what were then I think called like the grasslands of Purple Dust or something like that. And then after that, it actually shoots right up and takes over part of the Endless Waste and goes all the way up to the Great Sea. The Great Ice Sea, which is pretty huge. Like I believe it is the largest single empire that Faerun ever saw in terms of like land claimed. And it's when we get to how they did it, it's really wild. So yeah, another thing to note is that in the Arcane Age, because this is important because things are not the same, the plains of Purple Dust and the Rawan Dust Desert are wide, fertile plains that feed an empire with ease. They are not deserts. They are not awful. They are like a giant, happy breadbasket in the middle of the continent. It's fantastic. Nice weather, plentiful water, lots of animals, good grazing, good grain crops, whole bit. Nothing like what it is now. Now, the general culture of this place, the feel of Imaskar really has a Robert E. Howard, like Conan the Barbarian sort of feel, and the whole region does. But like this place really nails that sword and sandal vibe, and just like Imaskar leans hard into it. They dominated and subjugated everyone they encountered, with the notable exception of the Tarami. Like, there's a lot of different ethnic groups that are mentioned as being encountered, like the very distant ancestors of the modern horde, like the Tuangan, I can't pronounce that word properly, barbarians, all that sort of stuff. They're all mentioned as being conquered, but the Tarami are unique in that, this is a little bit of speculation here, But whatever the Turami were up to, they were not second-class citizens in the Empire. They were a part of it. And that sort of stuff changes as the editions go, but it's a really interesting little factoid there, like interesting bit of information. Back on topic though, Imaskar as presented is just it's another evil empire in the mold of all the other evil empires in the distant past. They practice slavery, and then they practice mass slavery, kidnapping people from other worlds on a mass scale. They reject the gods because that's always a great idea. And more or less, though, are kind of directionless. Like they're there, but there's no driving force behind. There's no animus driving them to do anything. And it's actually kind of weird reading about it, because with Netheril, I understood like what was driving them to do stuff. They had all these big goals, become an arcanist, master magic, cut the top off a mountain, flip it upside down, turn it into a floating city, all that sort of stuff. And that's not here with Imaskar. Like they really seem to have, like when their writers were putting it together, they're like, yep, they expand, they're there, and they're gone. And you're like, well, what were they? Why'd they expand? Why did they do any of these things? Like, what was their driving reasoning behind any of it? And nothing gets covered. Like nothing's there. Now, on the theology side of things, Imaskar stands unique in that they are presented as being a-religious. Like they're not atheists. They know that gods exist, but they reject them. They're described as being fearful and paranoid about gods and divine magic. And purportedly, their ruins are filled with magic and traps that are designed to target clerics and other users of divine magic and to degrade their powers and abilities. And it's really sort of the explanation that's offered is not a very good one for why. And I'll get to that when we're going through the history of the place. And as I mentioned, there's a possibility that this may explain why Netheril's Arcanists developed that bizarre ideology that gods weren't actually gods, that they were just like wizards who found ultimate magic. And I think that, again, speculation here, this may be something that came from their encounters with the artificers of Imaskar, and specifically the artificers of Lower Imaskar, who led the charge on like rejecting the gods and all that sort of stuff. And in the translation, cultural exchange translation that happens, instead of seeing them as gods and rejecting them as gods, the Netherese came to see the gods as just like wizards who found ultimate magic, all that sort of stuff. And it would explain why it was the Arcanists, and specifically the Arcanists of Netheril, who had those beliefs, whereas like the ruck and file of the population remained sort of fancy normal for religion. Like they worshipped their gods, their clerics and clergy were leaders of the public and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it would explain it, but it really doesn't explain why. The reasons given, and again, I'll get to those in a moment. It really doesn't make sense for why this became a national level thing in Imaskar. So groups of note. The only real group of note for Imaskar are the Artificers during the Arcane Age. These are the high magic users of the Empire, and their power transcends dimensions. Like they bend space and time to their will, but not a lot of is really known past that. Like, why are they called Artificers? Unknown. What was their ideology? We don't know. Why did they do anything they were doing? No idea. It's just a really odd thing. Like at one point they go from having an emperor to the emperor becomes the Lord Artificer, and a story. And then, again, things of interest. We note that there are other artificers with names that don't match the naming styles of the few that we get from Imaskar, and are instead coded as being, say, more Asian-like, like Kujawa, who later takes over part of the empire. So, history and editions. Oh boy. Okay. So, first edition, AD&D, Rauren appears in the campaign setting base book as another mythical lost empire. The plains of purple dust aren't even a thing yet, and the location of the Rauren Desert is simply the dust desert of Rauren or the stone desert. there's marginally more information than there is on Netheril, but that is not a high bar to reach it in first edition, like at all. Rowran is mentioned again in the Dreams of the Red Wizards, along with Durpar, but are described as lands that no one's heard from for centuries, implying that they were active until relatively recently in the first edition. So there's still, if you go purely off what's in the box set, it sounds like these places exist to the south of Thay. Contact was normal with trade until a few centuries ago, and then suddenly nothing. So nobody knows what's happened to them. And this is sort of par for the course with first edition. Forgotten Realms is what I'm finding, is that it's a very stark and almost like post-apocalyptic sort of setting. Second edition, big explosion of information. Same thing that happened with Netheril happens here. We see the term Imaskar for the first time, and their background is all fleshed out. Artificers are mentioned, as are prowesses with magic, impossible architecture, and what caused their fall in this edition is listed as unknown in the campaign setting, but they do set a date for it at minus 2,488 DR. Now, the Desert of Rowran and the Plains of Purple Dust are now connected up. The Rowran and the Imaskar are still used interchangeably, or Roran and Imaskar are used interchangeably, and this only happens in the campaign box set. After that, everybody just goes back to calling it the Roran Empire, or the Roran people, or the Roranese, and it's really sort of jarring, because like you're looking for Imaskar, then also realize, oh yeah, I got to look for Roran instead. Now, the Old Empire's book, it matches the date of minus 2488 DR as the end, and notes that survivors from the Empire fled west and settled on the shores of the Alhambra Sea. The Plains of Purple Dust are described as being a punishment, or the Plains of Purple Dust and the Roran Desert are described as being a punishment meted out by other gods on the victors of the God Wars. And they're described as and the Roran Empire, or the Imaskari, I'm just going to call them the Imaskari, they're described as having challenged the gods and won. And like, so whatever happened, they gained enough power, they were able to successfully challenge the gods and then defeated them. And in retribution, the other gods just smoked the place, just annihilated their empire and cast them down. So like pretty epic stuff there. Like I like that. Like that's cool. The Milan people are described as being the direct descendants of the Imaskari, and another ethnic group is mentioned who'll come up again a lot, and that's the forerunners of the modern Turami people of Turmish, who are the other canonically black population of Faerun, who are described as holding positions of power in the modern civilization, and implying they did so in the distant past as well. They confirm the Rowran have 8th and 9th level magic and epic magic, and then finally, it's like a weird sort of throwaway, the Rowran people, or Imaskari, are described as being Proto-Mulhorandi and Proto-Untherite, and that they seem to have generated their own deities internally, which just happened to match the Egyptian and Sumerian pantheons. And that's where things start to get really weird. So like this was coming up with a background that involved Mulhorand and Unther, and trying to explain why they chose to import real-world mythology more so into the Forgotten Realms, and it just sort of got weird fast. Third edition comes out, and this is where like a lot of the more modern take on it, like the information more people today know, all comes from this edition. So they're identified as being a tribe of humans of Drupari background. So they're a dark-skinned population that's vaguely coded in descriptions as being similar to looking like South Asians. And there's a sharp break from them being the origin people of Mulhorand and Unther. So they're like separated away from the Mulan completely. They're an entirely new group. Now they build an empire. They master space, time, and dimensional magic. Well, space and dimensional magic, not time magic, sorry. There's no chronomancy here. Suffer some setbacks, build massive portals, and proceed to kidnap the hell out of Egyptian and Sumerian peoples from a mythic Earth. So basically they go through just like and spend 400 years kidnapping tens of thousands of slaves from some mythical Earth. And their downfall is now attributed to the gods of all these peoples from this mythic Earth, finally hearing their, basically they kidnapped them and they set up a dimensional barrier around Faerun that prevented these people from contacting their gods. And somehow some of their prayers got out. Their gods heard, arrived, found they couldn't get through the shield. They talked to Lord Ao, basically calling him on the nonsense that this was. And so he agrees that they can come to the planet, they can circumvent the dimensional block if they take on avatar forms, which is exactly what they do. Now the god wars are between the Imaskari and the god kings and living gods of the Mulhorandi and Unthrites, with the final battle between the Lord Artificer and Horus happening like in the capital on the steps of the palace, with the Lord Artificer ultimately being defeated and some sort of massive magical backlash wiping everything out, creating the Plains of Purple Dust, creating the Rauran Dust Desert, and causing the complete collapse of the Empire. Now, Roranese, such an awkward name, refugees are still fleeing the area as late as 200 years after this happened. So, obviously you have some areas where people are surviving and making a living, and then they're slowly going out. This is the first mentions and descriptions of Deep Imaskar come here, which is a direct survivor state. They get more into what's going on in Changfeng, the province over in Shulong there, where they were, up on the plateau. And notes that one of their artificers would take one of the false Imaskarana, which I'll get into in a bit, and use that to claim the Dragon Throne and basically become one of the earliest dynasties of the Shulong Empire. So, kind of an interesting tie-in there. Now, there is one place worth mentioning, and that's Mitos. And Mitos was a full-size fortress that was acting as an outpost in the very unfortunately named Methwood. And it's sort of like, it's the furthest west they extend. Past that, there's sort of like some wilderness area that is inhabited by Tarami, who aren't part of the Empire. And then you have the Jamdath Psyocracy just past that. And apparently it was left with minimum personnel and an insanely complex portal magic system to defend it. And rumors persist that it was accessed by the Tarami, and presumably by Imaskari refugees as well, who were fleeing from the Mulan before being abandoned hundreds of years later. However, I think that another more proactive choice would be to have it as another survivor state, albeit a tiny one, and one dedicated to murdering every Unthrite who ventures into their territory. Because that's another note that they have, is that Unthrites avoid that area like the plague, because if they go there, they die. And people like being alive. So, 4th edition, no real big changes here. They stay the course from 3rd and introduce the survivor state of High Imaskar as the Deep Imaskari come back to the surface. And 5th edition, pretty much same with 4th edition, but the status of all of its survivor states is now in question. We don't know what's going on with Deep Imaskar. We don't know what's going on with High Imaskar, because they were a lot more active and out there than sort of is given the impression. I'll be talking about that in the next episode. So that's it. It's history through the editions. Now, oh man, the history as presented. This is awesome. So they actually broke it down into ages, which is really nice, and made like bullet pointing this for this episode so much easier. Now, so we start out the minus 8,350 to minus 7,975 DR. And this is the nascent state of Imaskar, formed by a tribe of Drupari descent. This is the Nemrut period, and they name themselves after their greatest warlord, Imaskar. Pretty straightforward stuff. They begin to expand, build up, and their empire is primarily in the area that we now know as the Plains of Purple Dust. And then they sort of sweep down everywhere else. In the next era, which goes from minus 7,975 to minus 6,422 DR, and this is the early dynastic period, so going for sort of a Egyptology-style naming convention system there. and sees the rise of the artificers and the positioning of Lord Artificer as the Empire. Sorry, as the Emperor, as the Emperor or Empress. So the Imaskari master portal magic very quickly and form an empire with minimal road infrastructure by using portals instead. Now, these portals are based on recovered and deciphered Batrachi arcane technology and methods. And for those of you who aren't tracking, the Batrachi are one of the creator races from the Days of Thunder. They were the amphibian and fish creator race who ultimately fell in a massive conflict against the giants, who destroyed them for very good reasons, because the Batrachi were doing some crazy stuff and ultimately summoned up a primordial and a whole bunch of other things to try to fight their war for them that ended up devastating the planet and possibly causing a minor ice age. You know, the usual sorts of mistakes you get in life. But they deciphered these... They deciphered how to do it and then just replicated it like crazy. Portal magic lets them reach the maximum extent in almost no time, stretching from the Golden Waters to the Great Ice Sea, from the Alhambra Sea to the Katakoro Plateau in Kartur. So, bang. Like, what they do is they build a portal, jump through, set up a return portal wherever they land, pour troops through, establish a new foothold, and wash, rinse, and repeat. So, they were the ultimate... expanding empire, and it's not explained why they stopped, because there was really nothing at this particular era. There's literally nothing around them except for some elven nations and dwarven nations. And the dwarven nations are underground and don't really care what's going on the surface, and the elven nations are largely isolationist in this phase. So not sure why they stopped, but they did that. Now apparently demon worship was their bag at the time. See here. What's the distance of these portals? Sounds like a weird subway system. Yeah, that's actually pretty much how I read it as well. It doesn't give a distance for them. We know that the largest ones that they would build and later on during the Chartres, very unfortunately named era, the largest ones were capable of reaching into other dimensions entirely, because that's how they were kidnapping people from other worlds. So I would guess that, anywhere from a few kilometers to hundreds of kilometers between portals, depending on the size and power they gave to them. And yeah, it is very much a weird subway system. It also allowed them to deploy troops like lightning to respond to threats. Because it could literally have troops go from the northern part of the empire to the southern part of the empire in the space of a day, which is amazing. But back on track here. So demon worship was apparently their thing at the time, because, why not? And in the middle of their capital, they had what they called the Temple of the Gaping Maw. I'm not going to lie to you. I do not want to live in a major city that has a place called the Temple of the Gaping Maw that is dedicated to Demogorgon in the middle of the capital city. Like, I don't want to be a part of that, but apparently they did. And having that there, it leads to the end of the early dynastic period, when a ton of demons emerged from it and razed the place. Just like lay waste to the place. It takes, troops are being brought in from all over the place to fight them. And it goes into an interregnum, and the empire divides in two, which leads us to the next year, the Middle Kingdoms period, which is minus 6,422 to minus 4,370 DR. In this period, Solon becomes the capital of Lower Imaskar, and actually continues on as a survivor state after the disasters. And Thakos becomes the capital of Upper Imaskar. Thakos survives into the modern day of the game as Saikoi in Western Shulung, which is pretty cool. Like, the city is still there and still active, and that's pretty much all there really is for this period. There is one big note, and that's hey, no problem. glad you made it out. So the only other big thing here is it notes that there's no cultural information for Upper Imaskar aside from the fact that they like basically absorbed all the different barbarian tribes there and brought them all on board. Whereas it notes that the southern area, the lower Imaskar, the artificers remained like in hard control. Like, so it was a much more authoritarian and a much more sort of, I guess, grim place or militaristic place to live. I'm not really sure. And that goes on until the Chartra occurs. And this is the darkness in Imaskari. I think Chartra is a terrible name, and somebody should have thought that out better. Anyways, so this is minus 4,372 minus 3920 DR. And this may sound familiar from the last show, but a plague incurable by the gods, who the Imaskari are, for some reason, now following, grips lower Imaskar, and it reads almost identically to the plagues that struck Azerim, one of Netherild's survivor states, in minus 33 DR. Crops die, animals die, people die, and the silent death grinds on till it simply stops one day. There's no one knows what stopped it. And it leaves, like, places that were minorly affected had a 20% fatality, like 20% population drop. Areas that were majorly affected were seeing like 80 to 100% fatalities. So it depopulates the entire area, and in addition to all the deaths from plague, you have massive food shortages because of famine caused by all the crops and animals dying. And this is given as the reason why the Imaskari turn against the gods. But wait, this doesn't really track, because only lower Imaskar suffered from the plague. Whatever was going on down there, Upper Imaskar, the northern area, was completely unaffected. Like, they sailed through this period with no issues. So I don't know, like, maybe they shut their portals down and prevented people from the south coming up into the north, or whatever happened. All the horrible stuff happens in the south and warps their culture. So like, they turn against the gods, and all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, the north carries on, and with this having happened, the south comes into the only possible solution they can come up with: mass slavery. No more of this, the low-key traditional slavery that they had going on prior to that. No, sir. It is time to do it right. So they build 2 giant brass portals covered in runes, spark those bad boys up, and spend the next 400 years kidnapping tens of thousands of slaves from a mythic Earth, specifically from that Earth's Egypt and Sumeria. And what follows is absolutely not how cultures work, and we'll wait until I do the Malhoran and Unther episodes. But for some, they somehow, over hundreds of years, retain their culture, do everything, and bring the gods back, and it gets weirder. Finally, the late period. So this is the run-up to the end. So minus 3920 to minus 2488 DR. Lots of big things happen in this era. The first one is the seven Imaskarana are made, and these are 7 artifacts that contain the totality of Imaskar's arcane knowledge and prowess. They also make the false Imaskarana, which are apparently, like, they're not false in the sense that they're fake, but, pardon me, they're lesser or incomplete in comparison to the true versions of the Imaskarana. And of all of these items, only one is named, and it's one of the false ones, and that's Donas's Shroud. Its powers are completely unknown. However, possessing it allowed Artificer Kujawa to claim the Dragon Throne and found Anok Imaskar. It gave sufficient power for that. Not enough for him to defeat a Celestial Dragon in hand-to-hand combat. Did not do that. But it did give him the power to start a new empire up. So those are made, and it's like they're mentioned over and over as these incredibly powerful artifacts, and there's zero information about them, what they do, where they are, anything. And I suspect that's probably why that Lich is digging up Solon, which is something we'll get into at the next episode. I don't want I'm spoiling the next episode as much as I am this today. Anyways, Well, that happens. Artificers there discover the plane of shadow, and they discover this like millennia before Netheril does. And its discoverer attempts to leverage what they find there to take over the Empire. They actually become a Shadow Lord. And like a whole thing goes down in Mythos, that like fortress outpost on the far western frontier of the Empire, that ends up with them being defeated and being sent into the plane of imprisonment, which does not sound fun to me like at all. But it does sound like something that would be an awesome adventure to run in the Arcane Age. I mean, you've got someone discovering the plane of shadow. You've got like intrigue, monsters. You're out on a frontier fortress, and you've got to like defeat this guy before he takes over the Empire. Like that's odd. Like that's D&D Adventures. What that is. And finally, minus 2489. The gods of the slaves taken from Mythic Earth cut a deal with Lord Ao, circumvent the barriers, and manifest as overstrength avatars, and initiate the Gods' War with the Imaskar with a massive slave revolt. So, that happens, and it takes 1 year. And there's a final showdown in minus 2488. Lord Artificer on his dragon mount rides out to fight the avatar of Horus, and gets killed, like straight up. They unleash all their magic. Horus has the edge, kills the guy, and an immediate magical backlash occurs that turns the plains of Roran into the dust desert, and creates the plains of purple dust. That we all know and love in the modern day. So like that's all some pretty serious stuff all happening. And then after that, you've got like the diaspora, and what is very brutally described as like a giant campaign of revenge. You have the Mulan people, so the Unthrites and the Mullerandi, basically engaged in a campaign of genocide and conquest, with the Mullerandi finally hitting the Alamber Sea and calling it a day and being satisfied, and the Unthrites continuing to pursue the Tarami and Imaskari down south and around the bottom of the sea, and up into what is now modern Unther, before they're finally rebuffed by the, I believe it was the Jamdath forces finally stopped them. So, like, a lot of stuff happened. And we'll get into that with the survivor states and with the actual nations that were left over, or that are left from this. Sorry, my throat's a little bit dry. It was a long night last night, turned into a long day today. So, my take on Imaskar in antiquity and a bit in the modern age. So, Netheril had a lot going on. Like, a lot. But Imaskar has so much more going on. The problem that Imaskar runs into really is that, on one hand, it is outside of the normal adventuring area of the Forgotten Realms. It is sword and sandal, not sword and sorcery or heroic fantasy. It's way off in the southeast corner of the regular map. It's not received a lot of good support over the years, and it suffers badly from a destroy the capital syndrome, where designers and writers decide, oh, the capital's fallen? Oh, well, that's the end then. They're defeated. You can't go on without your capital, of course. Anyways, but just like a cursory look at the massive empires of the real world and like how they broke up, and specifically how Rome broke up, which I think is a really good pattern for what happened here, tells us that there's a lot more that can go on. So in general, things I would do there, travel in the empire is unusual by any standard. Roads are intensely local. Like, there's roads around a village. There might be roads linking two villages if they're really close together, but that's it. It's just the roads that they need to do whatever it is that they're doing. All the other travel is done by portals. So like every village has a portal that leads to a larger village or a larger town or a city or something. And this is their way to trade and their way to get assistance when it's needed, all that sort of stuff. So outsiders coming into Imaskar are not even likely to know that they're there, like in the Empire, until they either encounter a military patrol or an outpost or a settlement. Hey, there's no roads linking everything up for them to follow. You just sort of like, it's wilderness, wilderness, wilderness. Whoa, why is there this really well-developed village or town in the middle of nowhere, not connected to anything? You know, it'd be like walking through like a field, like hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from any sort of civilization, and suddenly finding a road, following that road, and it leads you to a full-fledged town that is apparently disconnected from everything. Okay, and this would also explain why there's so many untouched or potentially still occupied ruins in the modern era. There's no road system to use to find anything, so you could get into that area, and you've got a desert that's blown over stuff, and there's no roads, there's no way markers, there's none of the conventional indicators that show there may be something at the end of this direction you're traveling in. Which means it's intensely difficult to explore. Next, I would lean so hard into the time and space manipulation. Well, sorry, space and dimensional manipulation. Let's see here. Does it say how the portals were activated? It does not. It says that they were made out of brass, they were covered in runes, and that's sort of where they leave off on it. Given that they were used so regularly, I would imagine that it wouldn't have been that hard of an operation to get them going. Like it would have been something that you could do from either end. So like it might even be something as simple as command words or something like that that activated them. It'd just be a matter of trying to figure out what they are, or they might even be on the devices themselves. So it's one of the more frustrating things dealing with the Arcane Age, is that a lot of the stuff goes undescribed because it's presented as information like, oh, if you wanted to do a game, you could, but the implication is that you're never going to use this or have access to it or be in that era, really. So yeah, they just like, there's so many gaps, and yeah, like how the portals were activated is one of them. But yeah, I would lean into that dimension and space manipulation. Imaskar buildings, settlements, everything appear small. And the wealthier the owners are, the more space is folded. So, like, part of this is, it's fantastic for farmland. If you fold the space around a village, you can have a huge village surrounded by arable land that looks like, a small collection of huts or something like that, until you enter it, and all of a sudden you find yourself in this large, fully fledged village. Another aspect of it is security. Attackers would have little idea of how large an area actually is prior to an attack. So planning for the attack, how many people you need, support, everything else like that, incredibly difficult, because you're looking at it, and is it a village? Is it a town? Is it a small house, or is it a multi-level mega mansion? You won't know until you're actually in it. And yeah, so this makes like planning and executing attacks extremely risky. Sorry, pardon me. And given how the portal system is their main form of movement, reinforcements are fast moving. So the minute, their equivalent of a flare goes up, or, they're able to signal that they need assistance, like we're talking like reinforcements could be arriving within minutes in overwhelming numbers. Because that's like a strong implication of this entire portal system. Reading it was that when trouble happened, legions would deploy rapidly and simply quash whatever's happening. Like they only had one military defeat, and it was against like a literal army of landworms. And that's fair, because an army of landworms is terrifying and will run most armies' shows. So like that's understandable. But yeah, like I would lean hard into that, because it makes the area really cool, and it means that adventuring in it and adventuring in those ruins, because it gains so much more potential than just going into like a regular set of boring, not space folded ruins like we do in the real world or in most games. So in deep antiquity, I think Imaskar, they're the rising power. So elven nations are in decline, they're self-isolating. Places like Jamdath and Kalimshan are rising, and I think it makes a really interesting dynamic because you have Jamdath, which is a psiocracy, so they've got sonic powers, mystics, psychic crystals, and just like all sorts of weird psionic things going on in that area that they're in. And they're more or less right next to Imaskar. Then just a little bit further past them, you have what will eventually be called Kalimshan, and at its start, it's run by Jinn and genies, and then some humans. Sort of, there's tons of Janazi and all sorts of cool stuff's going on. And because Imaskar uses portals instead of roads, it makes them really unique and versatile. Like if they can gain permission to set up a portal somewhere for trade purposes, which would obviously like be somewhere that could be controlled because no one wants to have a portal open up, like just flood troops in and take a place over. But it means that they could facilitate trade and make a killing doing it, using that system. And I'm really surprised they didn't go that direction with it. I think Jamdath would likely be a trade partner, but they'd probably creep the Imaskari out a bit with their psychic powers. And the other big thing I could see, and my take on it is, I could see a developing cultural difference between what would become the upper and lower kingdoms. The former developing a more central or northern Asian coding as a culture, as a mix with these larger populations they've conquered, because it's something that's noted throughout the entire thing is that the Imaskari were not segregationists. They didn't separate themselves out from the peoples that they conquered. They intermixed with them, and sort of brought them into the empire like that. So I could see the northern area, so Upper Imaskar, developing this different identity, whereas the south would remain truer to the original culture and appearance of the founding population, because those are the people they're encountering and they're conquering. They're all sort of part of the same larger ethnic group. And it feels to me that that this would be a divide that would happen almost immediately. And the fact that we have artificers with names like Kujawa and so on implies to me that they were very likely similar to Rome at its height, where you had a polyethnic population under a larger cultural umbrella. And that is something that you just do not see often in fantasy at all. Very often everything is very tied to specific ethnic group X does this, and never the two shall meet if they meet Y and Z or whatever. But this has that feeling to me as I'm reading it, that it was a polyethnic population, and that there was a larger sort of Imaskari identity that they had over top of that. Because remember, a lot of these groups they're encountering, they're not what we would say conventionally see as being a full-fledged civilizations and stuff like that. It's not a case of Rome conquering Egypt and Egypt just continuing to be Egypt because they're already well established. These are barbarian tribes that are just sort of getting things sorted out, who suddenly find themselves part of this giant, wondrous, magical empire that can teleport across could teleport from the top to the bottom of the continent in the space of a good day's walking. So the implication is that I think they would probably come on side more than fight to maintain their independence, especially given the sheer number of monsters roaming around the world at that point. Now, antiquity. This is where the Empire's in trouble. And I'd keep the place divided as it was in the books, but I'd make them far more distinctive at the end of it. For all intents and purposes, you end up with two radically different cultures coming from a common background. So, the South has gone hard on slavery, Lower Imaskar, they've rejected the gods, mass slavery from other planets, and meanwhile, up in the North, they've remained more pious. They still worship the gods. They're if they practice slavery at all, it's the traditional slavery that's been practiced for them. They're generally more progressive after a fashion. And that this leads to a lot of friction when the two reunite, for whatever reason. It's actually, you know what? No, I wouldn't even reunite them. I think that was one of the strangest plot points in the entire, in my entire reading of this thing, was the reuniting of the two kingdoms, because there's two very different animals at that point, and the other reason being that after the Gods' War ended, nothing happened to Upper Imaskar. It wasn't included, like from Semfar north. None of that was included in like the creation of the desert. Nothing was decimated. Nothing was destroyed. All their infrastructure, population, peoples, everything were fine. But for some reason they collapsed like everybody else did. And I just, no, I would actually leave them be, and I would concentrate all the disaster onto onto Lower Imaskar. So I would not rejoin them. Yeah, it's ridiculous. So next thing I do, I'd link the sickness that came, and like laid out Lower Imaskar. I would link that actually to Azerim, thousands of years later. I love the sound of, I gotta try to pronounce this again, Kai Putaito, this demon goddess or demigoddess or something like that. I love the idea that she was perhaps summoned by one of the Imaskari or something like that, in Lower Imaskar, and just ran wild. But then something happened. Maybe the artifact that summoned her was damaged or shut down, or something happened, and it ended her ability. Like maybe they wiped out all of her worshippers. They found the cult, wiped them out, and she wasn't able to get back into the world. And then thousands of years later, you have some people, going through relics recovered from one of the many fallen sky cities in Netheril. They're in Azerim. They're like, oh, this looks interesting. What's this? Oh, that's an Imaskari artifact. Then they work with it, end up summoning her again, and you get the events that go down in Azerim. I think that would be really cool. It'd be a way to link the two. It creates some neat continuity, and it gives better reason for these like all-encompassing life annihilating plagues that hit the planet. And so the other thing I would change is I would keep some desert, some of the villages in the desert as functional. They're enfolded space, and I think the idea of having like weird little oases that are nobody can get to, and no one's sure how big they are, I think that's kind of a neat idea. And now into the Fall of Magic era that I talked about before, they don't make it into this technically, but as this is the my take part of the show, I would say that my take for the Fall of Magic is, as I said, I would keep Upper Imaskar. I think it should persist as a major power in the region. The Golden Road gets built and goes through it, becoming a major source of revenue and the only major road that goes through the entire kingdom. They could have intermittent issues with the Tugians and other populations, giants, stuff like that up there. They retain the old travel methods, which makes their territory difficult to traverse if you get off the Golden Road. And I would have them like persist all the way into the modern day. And then I'd have them in being a similar state to Kalimshan. They're formerly great, but much reduced in power and prestige. Time takes its toll. They're an ancient civilization. They've got a really awesome independent culture that's like nothing like, they still call themselves Imaskari, but they're nothing like the Imaskari of Deep Imaskar or anything else like that. And if you poke them with a stick enough, they're an incredibly dangerous foe to wake up. But for the most part, they're just sort of just there and existing in that part of the world that they're in. I think that would be cool. I think that would also add a really good fantasy element to that area, because if you have a space on your map that's just endless grasslands beside endless grasslands, and the best name you can come up for it is the Endless Waste, that is boring. Like that doesn't inspire adventure. That doesn't do anything. Drop an ancient civilization into it that uses portals to teleport around inside of it, And you could even have more fun. Like you could have them trying to expand back down into the south. Maybe they're trying to reclaim Semfar. Maybe they're sending out people to explore into the dust desert or into the plains of purple dust, dodging Mulhorandi patrols and stuff like that, because the Mulhorandi still aren't fans of them. It's just that gives adventure seeds. Endless Waste is an environmental obstacle that your party has to plan around crossing by buying a whole bunch of ox carts, a whole bunch of supplies, and then surviving random encounters for like 3 or 4 sessions before they get to the end of it. Just my thoughts on that. So, next episode, Imaskar Part 2, The Survivor States. If everything goes correctly and vaguely according to plan, that will be happening on the 19th of January. Next weekend, I am down at OrcaCon in Seattle, so if anyone's there, please come see me. I think there's still a few seats left in my world building workshop, and I would love to see anybody who watches come up. I'd love to meet people face to face. And yeah, next episode though, January 19th. So thank you very much for listening. This has been Lore Diver, a POCGamer podcast. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe. If you want to see more, head over to my blog, POCGamer.com, and check out POCGamer on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you'd like to support this podcast, I've got Ko-fi and Patreon links up on my blog and social media. Please feel free to contribute to the cause with that. Music was provided by purple-planet.com. Thanks for listening, and have a great night.